Welcome back to the third instalment of the Chronicles and Back to School. I'm your host, David. Now, in this little series, we are going to explore some little tricky rules and maybe some hints and tips that I can give you from my experience of playing Heresy over the last few years. Now, it's not a definitive thing. It's just stuff that's come up in games that I've played. And sometimes we come into these certain circumstances on the channel, and it's really important that before we do any filming that we kind of sit down with the two guests and just talk about the options. And in this particular Back to School series, we are going to talk about the enemy's deployment zone and capturing it. Now, to start off with, we just need to explore the rules very slightly. Line Breaker is a thing. It's a secondary mission and is an optional secondary mission. And it will detail in the secondary mission part of the mission description whether that comes into play. Now, oddly enough, Line Breaker does not make an appearance in any of the secondary objectives in the 6 missions in the Red Book, which is pretty odd. I must admit, I haven't looked into the Black Books, but I'm sure it will feature somewhere along there or maybe sometime in the future. But it currently does not feature in the rule set in the 6 missions in the Red Book. Now, Line Breaker is really key to this whole little series here because it stipulates that one model can be in the enemy's deployment zone at the end of the game. So I'll just read it to you quickly. We'll flash it up on the screen here. It says, if at the end of the game a player has at least one model from one or more scoring units completely within 12 inches of the enemy's table edge, they score 1 victory point. So if you have 10 tactical marines making their way back across the battlefield to capture the enemy's deployment zone, you can just have one of those marines in that deployment zone to score that secondary objective. Now, because the channel is all about visuals, I've made a very, very simple board. Realm battle tile, painted, flocked, and then just the riser pattern ruins the complete building here. Just super simple. Now, what you have to imagine is there's an imaginary line running from this point here all along to the corner of this building. That's your reference point, and that is essentially the enemy deployment zone, just for argument's sake. So just to give it to you in real simple fashion, if this 10-man tactical Imperial Fist squad have one model within that line, 2-inch coherency, of course, they will score a victory point at the end of the game. So this is really key to this little segment here. That's fine. We know that. Line Breaker doesn't feature in the Red Books, so we're not going to worry about it too much. The bit that has really caught me out in the past is it features in 2 missions, and it's capturing the enemy's deployment zone. So that features in Tide of Carnage. Just double checking my rules as we go. So Tide of Carnage and Shatter Strike, and I'll flash this up as well and I'll read it to you very quickly. All right, so in Shatter Strike, it says at the end of the game, each player scores 2 victory points for every scoring unit in the enemy's deployment zone and 1 victory point for every denial unit in the enemy's deployment zone. Fine, we've got that. Next, we'll move on to Tide of Carnage. And that's essentially where the battlefield is worth different points at the end of the game if you control it. So again, I'm just going to read this to you very quickly. In order to claim a sector, a side must have 1 or more scoring units in the sector, and an enemy must have no scoring units left in that sector. So really, really simple. Now, the way this has caught me out is that I read the rules to say in, which for me, if you've got a 10-man tactical unit or a vehicle or a Spartan or whatever you've got, or a single character, whether it's scoring or not, in means wholly within. So this line here, so as far as I'm concerned, in is, and I'm sure you know what in is, but we'll give you a visual representation that that entire squad is within that deployment zone. Now, the way it's caught me out in the past is that, you know what it's like. Turn 5, turn 6, you're nearing at the end of the game. It's random game length. You're confident you're on the last turn, and the enemy has made a play. So what they've done is they've moved this 10-man tactical unit as far as they can in the movement phase into the deployment zone. Maybe they've ran, whatever they've done, but their final move ends them where 3 Marines or 3 Terminators, 3 Thalax, whatever the enemy may be, are within that enemy deployment zone, and the rest of the squad isn't. And then we've come to the end of the game, great game, handshake, thanks very much, let's top up the victory points. And they've said, well, I've scored it, or it's a denial, whatever. That's 2 points to me, 1 point to me. And I've gone, well, hang on a minute. I think you need to be wholly within, and they've just said, well, it's in. You are right. Some members of the squad are in, but they're not all in. So this is where they're kind of, it's a bit tricky, because you don't want to be that guy saying, oh, I'm sorry, I don't, you don't want to be that guy. You want to have a fun game, but also it's really important to establish those rules. The way I play it is that I push as hard as I can to get that squad wholly within. So if you've got in the back of your mind, I'm not going to worry shooting about that squad because they're not going to get wholly within, even with a run move. It's a bit of a gamble, I know. I'll deviate my firepower onto something else that can score me a point, taking out a rhino, or sniping out a character from a squad with a lucky insta-kill and a failed lookout sir, whatever it might be, and I'm not going to worry about that squad. Forget about it, they're not going to score. And at the end of the game, your opponent says, well, actually, I've claimed a victory point or 2 victory points, scoring, non-scoring. And you think, really tricky. It's those moments where you think, I wish we'd clarified at the beginning of the game, wholly within, partially within, in. To me, in means wholly within. And we can compare that to when you deploy, it says deploy in your deployment zone. Well, when you deploy, you wholly put your squad in your deployment zone. You don't straddle it half and half. So that's the comparison I draw. But sometimes it's still, and I look, do you know what? We should have clarified at the beginning of the game, have your points. It's just not worth arguing about. Now, to mitigate against this and to score those points, there's a couple of things you can do. One is, first of all, if you know you're playing Tide of Carnage or Shatter Strike or something that involves that the capturing of objectives, it's really important at the beginning of the game to say, look, how are you doing this? Talk to your opponent, discuss about what your options are and how you claim those sectors. The other thing could be said for a Spartan as well. Does the assault ramp over the line count, or does the vehicle have to be wholly within? It's a little bit tricky. And sometimes you'll get a Spartan move into a deployment zone, it will be half and half, and then your opponent will rotate it, cheeky, 90 degrees because obviously a Spartan's longer than it is wide, so if you rotate it, you can gain a little extra inches. It's a real tricky little tricks you can play there, but I totally get it. If you're playing a competitive game, you want to get as much points as you can, and you will try everything in the book to get those points. I totally get it. So we need to explore that. Now, there are a couple of options to mitigate that, as I mentioned. One, talk to you about the opponent. That's great. But also as well, if you establish those rules right from the start, you then have a better chance about making more informed decisions. So what do I mean by that? I mean that if your opponent, it's their last turn, have made a push for the board, okay? So they've moved their squad up, they're coming in. So this is our imaginary line. So let's have a look. So by my reckoning, if we draw a little line down here with a tape measure, we've got 2 models wholly within and 1 Marine half, and then we've got 2, 4, 5 Marines that are outside the deployment zone. Now we need to think, they've moved their 6 inches move, they're going to try and run. So if they run, average roll on a dice of a run, it's D6, isn't it? So it's 3 or 4 inches. Is that squad going to make the line? So the whole squad have to be in if you've declared that at the beginning of your game. I know that this tactical marine is 5 inches to the line, 6 to be wholly within. So I need to make a decision. Do I spend my last turn shooting at this tactical squad, or do I go somewhere else and try and take a rhino out, or try and snipe a character like I mentioned earlier, or go for a drop pod? We always forget rhinos and drop pods at the end of the game, during the game. Then all of a sudden it's like, it's a points grab. Let's go for the armor 12 or the armor 10, armor 11 rear or side of that rhino. So the decision here is, what do you do? It all depends what firepower you've got left at the end of the game. Now, if you can guarantee you can shoot and completely destroy that squad, then absolutely go for it. But killing 10 tactical marines is no mean feat, and you've got to have the tools to do it. You might not at the end of the game, but let's say, for example, you decide to go for it. If we look here, we've got 1 tactical marine, then it's equidistant between a sergeant with artificer armor and another tactical marine. Now that's going to get a bit tricky, because if you're shooting autocannons or some low AP weapons or some bolters even, or volkites, they're probably not going to get through that model. But what you're doing as well, by removing that marine, you're now making it easier for your opponent to make a run move in the next phase, right? So let's have a quick measure now. Now you see 4 inches will get that marine wholly within that deployment zone. So you've actually made it really easy for them. So when they come to shoot, When they come to run, in their movement phase, okay, they rolled a 3, fair enough, that's halfway, I guess. They will fail and not score that point, but they could easily roll a 4, 5 or 6 and get that squad in. Now, if you're determined to wipe that squad out and you don't manage it, and maybe you kill the sergeant and that tactical marine, you've now made that Imperial Fist squad even easier. They now require 2 inches to capture that. So the question you have to ask yourself is it worth shooting that squad, reducing the numbers, and then they get a good run move and then making it to their deployment zone in their final turn? A really tricky situation to be in. You know, we always want to kill stuff, no doubt, but it might cost you 1 or 2 points at the end of the game. And when games are close and we move into the final stages of games, those points absolutely count between a win or a loss, or even pulling back a draw. If you've had a rough game all 5 or 6 turns, you know, this could be a way to claw the points back and grab you some points. So it's a tricky one, isn't it? The other thing to bear in mind as well is you might have some weapons that are pinning. Pinning is great. You can pin the squad, that might work too. But generally, the squad might have a Vexilla, they'll get a reroll. Some units are immune to pinning as well, Death Guard in particular, I think. And you just might not pin the squad. It's a real big gamble. You're better off letting your opponent lose to their own dice. You know, they've moved up as far as they can, then you get your turn to shoot, and then in their final turn, they need that massive, that's a 6-inch now, that's a 6-inch roll. What are the chances of them getting a 6-inch run move in their shooting phase to claim that objective? You know, and sometimes it might come down to a couple of mil. It depends where you draw the line here. Are you going to be, well, in theory you should be. If it's not in, it's not in, you know. And if it's a couple of mil or a couple or 3 centimeters over or under, you know, you need to decide where the line is. For me, it's in, and that back of that base has to be wholly within that line. You know, it's a bit tricky. You want to have fun with your games, but at the same time, you want to play a fun game as well. I think it's a really difficult thing to call. The other thing to consider is that maybe the squad has fleet. And if they have fleet, they can re-roll that run move. Again, it's a dice game. You know, we've all seen multi-melters roll a 1 to hit, or you get a hit and then you roll a 1 to miss. That run move can happen the same. And I'll do a quick, very inaccurate poll here. I see we rolled a 6 straight off the bat. It's tricky, isn't it? And another 6 would have worked. Then equally we've rolled a 2 and then a 5. You know, I'm not going to sit here rolling dice because it's all academic, isn't it? You know, you guys know the deal. But you can definitely help yourself. I personally, if I was in this situation, depending what I had left on the board, depending what targets I had around the board, like a rhino, or the easy stuff to take care of, a character in a squad maybe, I would probably leave this tactical squad to their own fate. We always want to try and command our own fate, I know, but you know, if that squad is 6 inches away, chances of making that run move is really slim. I personally would leave it, but we all play our own game. It's an emotional game. We get tied up. Towards the end of the game, we don't always think straight. You know, it's really tough. Anyway, a little rules query there to talk about. Hopefully you found that interesting. You know, it's really easy to talk about certain things like this in isolation. No pun intended. But when you're in the heat of battle, you make difficult decisions, and sometimes they're not always the right one. But you can kind of work through this and logically think, you know, will those Thalax with those 3 lightning guns kill 3 of those Marines, cause a pinning check and make them fall back? Maybe, probably not. Leave them alone, direct your firepower somewhere else. I don't know. Totally your decision, but it's definitely caught me out, and I think it's one of those rules that just needs a little conversation before the game to clarify. I really hope you've enjoyed this. I know these videos are very short, small snippets of information, but I've got a ton more of these in my brain, which I've written down, and we'll kind of bash these out over the next few weeks. If you found it interesting or helpful, please let me know. I'd love to hear your thoughts and comments about it. And we'll see you in the next one.